Growing up, I remember three magazines that were always on my mother's coffee table. There was Ebony, Essence, and Black Enterprise. Black Enterprise has inspired four generations of African Americans to build wealth through entrepreneurship, career advancement, and money management. This iconic magazine was founded by the subject of today's video, Earl G. Graves. Earl Graves was born on January 9, 1935 in New York. He was the eldest son of Earl Godwin Graves and Winifred Collette Seeley Graves. Earl was introduced to the world of entrepreneurship early, obtaining his first job selling Christmas cards for his Uncle John. After graduating from Erasmus Hall High School in Brooklyn, where he was one of 20 black students in a school of 7,500, Earl's father wanted him to attend a college close to home so he could save money by not living in a dorm. Earl, however, had other ideas. After being accepted to Morgan State University, he took the $617 he had saved and headed to Maryland. To get through school, Earl worked a variety of jobs and creatively borrowed money from his Uncle Joe. In addition, Earl constantly sought out income opportunities. For instance, after noticing the vast amount of flowers that were purchased during homecoming week, the shrewd Graves made a deal with the area florist that got him 10% of all the shop's sales to Morgan State students, thus engineering his own version of flower power. Graves was also a member of ROTC while in college, and this led to a 3-year stint in the U.S. Army as an officer after graduation. Captain Graves was also a paratrooper, but wings weren't the only thing he got. He went on a blind date with Barbara Kidd, and this date blossomed into a romance. On July 2, 1960, the two married. They had 3 sons and would remain together until Barbara's passing in 2012. Earl had no interest in a prolonged military career and discharged in 1960. After returning home, he knew he had to do something to take care of his new bride. Once again, displaying the drive that would help him later build an empire, Graves flipped through the yellow pages and called up Ajax Realty, a real estate office that happened to be near his house. He told Ajax he had an experienced salesman that would be a great fit for them. After piquing their interest, Earl hung up the phone, waited a few minutes, and then called back saying, "I understand you're interested in talking to me." Graves then marched into the office and was immediately hired. He went on to sell 9 houses in his first 3 months, demonstrating he clearly had a knack for salesmanship. Although gainfully employed, Graves wasn't sure that real estate was his calling. During the turbulent times of the 1960s civil rights movement, Graves developed an interest in politics. In 1965, this interest led to a job as an assistant to Robert F. Kennedy. Graves held this job until the fateful day of RFK's 1968 assassination. Graves, who was standing outside the Ambassador Hotel when Kennedy was shot, referred to that day as a seminal moment in his life. After this tragedy, Graves and the other Kennedy staffers were given Ford Foundation grants. Graves used his grant to go to Barbados, the home of his relatives. While there, he made a life-changing observation. Even though the blacks in Barbados were in power, being in charge of the government, they were not in charge of the businesses and lacked the resources to do so. To help remedy this, Graves started a management consulting company named Earl G Graves Associates, Incorporated. The following year, he founded Earl G Graves Publishing Company, Incorporated. He noticed the increasing number of African American professionals that needed information on careers, personal finance, and the unwritten rules of networking in corporate America. Graves started a newsletter to address this and to also highlight people making moves in the black business community. This newsletter was the blueprint that eventually evolved into Black Enterprise. In 1970, Graves' company, with an assistance of a $175,000 SBA loan, began publishing Black Enterprise magazine. The goal of this magazine was not only to cover and highlight black-owned businesses, but also to show African Americans how to thrive professionally and economically as proactive, empowered citizens. At the time, a publication targeting the African American business community was an unexplored idea, and Graves found he had to hustle extra hard to even get in the door of potential advertisers just to tell his story. But Graves pulled out all the stops, using personal connections such as Julian Bond and Shirley Chisholm to accompany him on sales calls. While this may seem a little unconventional, Graves was selling much more than mere ad space. He was selling the waves of change, and he needed to convince people that there was indeed a market for his vision. He also managed to assemble a list of leading African American professionals in the country. While such a list can easily be obtained today, this was no small feat in the early 1970s. This helped prove there was indeed a market for Black enterprise, and Graves was determined to not only highlight, but to serve that market. To get people reading the magazine, Graves began sending free copies of Black enterprise to Black ministers, politicians, and many of the very corporations that he intended to cover. Magazine publication has always been a challenging business with a low success rate, but Earl Graves was not aware of this. So not only did he survive, he also thrived as Black enterprise became profitable after only 10 months of existence. The annual sales topped $1 million in 1972 and steadily climbed, topping the $5 million mark in 1978 and passing $12 million in 1984. Revenue continued to climb each year, with the exception of 1990, when it failed to surpass the 1989 revenue of almost $22 million. But this was a mere blip, as by its 20th anniversary in 1990, Black enterprise had a robust circulation of over 230,000 and annual revenues over $15 million. The magazine, which taught its readers how to recognize and build their economic power, managed to carve out a niche for itself as a combination of Forbes, Money Magazine, and Fortune that just happened to target an African American audience. As Black enterprise grew, its goals started to evolve. Graves wanted to chronicle the growth of Black companies, and in 1973 began compiling the Black Enterprise 100, an annual list of the nation's largest Black businesses. Berry Gordy's Motown led the first list with $40 million in gross sales and remained in the top spot until finally being dethroned in 1984 by the Johnson Publishing Company. The entire gross sales of the 1973 list was $450 million. But it didn't take long before that number was well into the billions. Black enterprise itself has made the top 100 list each year from 1973 to 2019, climbing to as high as number 34 in 1989. As a matter of fact, Graves actually operated 2 companies that made the BE 100 list. In January of 1988, a 53-year-old Graves was flying to a speaking engagement, something he did regularly. On this particular flight, while engaging in the mundane airplane small talk, Graves discovered the man sitting next to him was actually a senior-level executive for Pepsi. Graves showed him a copy of his magazine. After reading it, the executive mentioned how Pepsi happened to be looking to do a deal with a prominent Black businessman. Graves talked to the Pepsi people for the next 2.5 years, and in July of 1990, he teamed with basketball legend Magic Johnson to pay $60 million to own a Pepsi franchise. Pepsi Cola of Washington, D.C., LP, was a Forestville, Maryland-based sales distribution facility that served D.C. and a small part of Prince George's County in Maryland. This franchise proved to be very successful and made the BE 100 in its first year with $44 million in revenue. Their accounts included the White House, the U.S. Capitol, and Air Force One. And why partner with an NBA star? Well, as Magic himself remarked, it was an opportunity to learn some business magic from Earl Graves. Yes, this man could even teach magic to Magic. Graves pulled double duty, remaining as Black Enterprise's publisher while also serving as CEO of his successful Pepsi franchise until selling majority share back to Pepsi in 1999. By the way, that Pepsi franchise? Well, it was on the BE 100 every year that it existed. Earl Graves made a footprint on the business world that was very pronounced. In 1997, he wrote a book titled How to Succeed in Business Without Being White, which became a bestseller. In 1998, Graves was awarded the NAACP Spring Iron Medal, which is the organization's highest honor, whose other recipients include Oprah, George Washington Carver, and Martin Luther King. In 2002, Fortune magazine named Graves one of the 50 most powerful and influential African Americans in corporate America. In 2007, Graves was inducted into the U.S. Business Hall of Fame, which recognizes the contributions of the nation's most distinguished corporate professionals who have enriched the economy and inspired young people to pursue excellence in business and in life. Graves retired as CEO of Black Enterprise in January of 2006 and named his son Earl Jr., known as Butch, as his successor. Butch championed Earl's intentions, which were not just to make a wildly successful magazine, but to create a brand. With Butch at the helm, Black Enterprise evolved into a multimedia company with 2 TV shows and a nationally syndicated radio show. The company also maintained its focus on hosting events, something it had started as early as 1998 when the business description on their BE 100 listing included upscale recreational events. Today, those events include the Entrepreneur Summit, the Women of Power Summit, and a host of virtual events. This shift in focus, as well as the industry's movement from print to digital, inevitably altered the magazine's publication frequency. Black Enterprise switched to bi-monthly starting in November of 2016 and quarterly in January of 2019. A look at the Black Enterprise website also reveals the vaunted BE 100 list was last published in 2019, although this was most certainly due to other world-altering reasons. Earl Graves remained as chairman of the company he founded until he passed away on April 6, 2020, after a long battle with Alzheimer's. He'd once stated in a 2006 interview that he wanted his legacy to be that family was most important and that he made a difference in education as well as extended family. Mission accomplished, Earl. Thank you for watching. This is In the Black.